Welcome to At Home and Abroad with Harris and Walker. Join us each week as we follow our curiosity, diving deep into the familiar and the foreign. Reach beyond your front door as we uncover new perspectives, explore intriguing ideas, and have real conversations with the best guests. Ready for something different? Let's get started. In 2017, children's book author Amy Krouse Rosenthal penned a submission entitled, "You May Want to Marry My Husband," for the Modern Love column in the New York Times. It was essentially a personal ad for her beloved husband, Jason Rosenthal, who she was leaving behind to guide their 3 children when she inevitably succumbed to ovarian cancer. The column retold their love story and extolled Jason's many virtues as a husband and a father. It's no surprise that the column ignited a flood of messages for Jason. In his words, Amy's essay caused me to experience grief in a public way. Many of the readers who reached out to me wrote beautiful words of reflection. The scope of Amy's impact was deeper and richer than even us and her family knew. Some of the responses I received helped me with the intense grieving process because of their humor. Jason confessed that he often laughed through the tears and admitted that when he did smile and laugh, he knew it was okay. He said, "Amy gave me permission to move forward, and I'm so grateful for that."
What a gift she gave him in allowing that freedom, eh, Harris?
Mm-hmm.
Permission to not only move forward, but be happy again?
Mm-hmm.
That could only be so helpful in the darkest days of grief.
Yeah.
But the ones leaving us are also experiencing grief as well, aren't they?
Oh, of course they are. If we know that death is coming, it's really hard to let go of our lives. The National Cancer Institute says that grief is the normal response to a major loss, such as the death of a loved one. Grief may also be felt by a person with a serious long-term illness or with a terminal illness. And it can include feelings of great sadness, anger, guilt, and despair. Physical problems, such as not being able to sleep and changes in appetite, these also may be part of grief. Acceptance of a future without your loved ones, that's really the most bitter pill to swallow.
On both sides.
Most definitely.
The dying and those left behind as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's our perceived finality of death that is the most difficult to process, I think. It's heart-wrenching.
Mm-hmm.
Whether the death is expected, sudden, whether the person is young, old, that is just the most challenging thing to grapple with.
Right. But if you know that death is coming or your loved one is ill, anticipatory grief is experienced. There's time to prepare, though. There's times for things to be said that need to be said, and the dying can have some say in their end-of-life arrangements. Regardless, it's so hard on so many levels. But on the other hand, the sudden loss of a loved one is too shocking. We've had a couple of unexpected deaths in our family and friend circle in the past few years, and it's like the floor disappears beneath your feet. There's no time to say goodbye or to steel yourself for what's to come, and of course that can lead to some regrets.
Grief, of course, is not limited to the people in our lives either. Really, it is a part of all loss, like losing our pets.
Oh yeah, which is a terrible experience. I think the grieving of a fur baby who's crossed the rainbow bridge is somehow unique. I'm not sure if it's because they're just so trusting of us and so vulnerable. I don't know what it is, but these beautiful, loving souls, they just leave such a tremendous void when they pass. But loss extends beyond death and dying, doesn't it, Walker?
It certainly does.
It could be a loss of a marriage or a friendship. It can even be ecological grief.
Ecological grief, what's that?
Well, it's pretty top of mind these days. Ecological grief, sometimes known as solastalgia, is the grief felt in relation to experienced or anticipated ecological losses, including the loss of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes due to acute or chronic environmental change. So grief really plays a pivotal role in truly all kinds of loss.
For sure, loss forces an upheaval in our lives, and we have to figure out how to move forward. And with loss, we often have to reevaluate our own selves as well. I bet some people delay or even avoid ending a relationship just to avoid grief. It's just not much fun to feel, is it?
God, not at all. In my own personal experience, I've wanted to literally shed my own skin and run away just to escape the intensity of grief. It can have its moments of being just purely unbearable. But have you ever thought about the experience of grief when we experience the death of a dream?
Oh, for sure. Think of an athlete who's trained for the Olympics their entire life, only to become injured in an accident and never be able to make it to the games.
Oh, yeah, it's terrible. I experienced this sort of when my eldest was born. I knew that when he was born, our lives would not be on the same trajectory as most other parents.
Right.
And it would be a completely new experience that I was really afraid that I wouldn't be able to face or manage. So I had to mourn the vision of that life that I gave up,
Yeah, the
right?
idea you had.
Yeah.
Grief is so powerful, and it's something that we all have in common no matter where we live, how much money we make, or what we do for a living.
It's really kind of fascinating. We're looking forward to our conversation today with American author and therapist Claire Bidwell Smith. Led by her own experiences with grief and fueled by her work in hospice and private practice, Claire strives to provide support for all kinds of people experiencing all kinds of loss. And she does so exceptionally well in her recent book, Conscious Grieving, A Transformative Approach to Healing from Loss. Claire has been featured and written for various publications, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Scientific American, the LA Times, CNN, and more. She deeply loves her work and is devoted to expanding the conversation about grief and loss. We are so honored to have you here at Home and Abroad, Claire.
Thank you for having me.
So perhaps we should begin with what you mean by grieving consciously.
It's a good question. I think the word conscious gets bandied about a bit much these days, and but I used it very intentionally. I think that loss is something that happens to us when we go through a significant loss, whether it's someone we love, or it's a job, or an illness, or a home. I think that is something that happens to us. We don't have a lot of choice over the matter. We didn't invite it. We didn't seek it out. And so it's this thing that's really happening to us. But how we grieve is up to us. How we choose to find support, how we choose to work through our emotions, use tools and techniques, open ourselves up to the process, learn from it, and eventually and hopefully transform through it, we really do have some agency over. And I think we get a little mixed up in there because this thing is happening to us and it feels so beyond our control that we begin to think that the grief itself is beyond our control as well. And it's not that we can control grief, but we do really have some say about how we can lean into it and embrace it as a means of healing.
Right. And manage it. That's an amazing gift to give people, some agency over their grief, because it can be so overwhelming, particularly at the beginning. And it also gives people hope that you can actually find some light at the end of the process and transform.
Absolutely. I really wanted this book to be hopeful and reassuring. I think there are some takes on grief that look at it as an affliction or this horrible thing you've been burdened with and have to figure out how to get through and overcome. But I think that grief is something that we will all experience in our lifetimes in one form or another, multiple times perhaps, and that we know how to do it on like a very basic human level. This is something we know how to do, and that it can really afford a lot of opportunities in terms of growth, how we understand ourselves, how we make meaning out of our lives, how we choose to be in relationships and love. I'm not saying it's easy. It's definitely not easy. It's incredibly difficult to go through big loss. There's so much anguish and torment and fear and pain that we have to walk through. But with that comes other things as well.
Absolutely. So your book shines light and gives permission to allow grief that extends beyond our normal definitions of loss, which I personally found really liberating. Can you share a little bit more about the many types of grief that we can encounter in our lives?
Yeah, there's so many. I mean, I think inherently at its core, loss is about change. None of us are good at change. Sometimes,
Very
we
true.
seek it out, but often change is happening to us and it can be difficult. And so grief comes in so many different ways. We start grieving very early on in our lives. Maybe we move homes or change schools or lose a pet or even go through the death of someone close to us, or our parents get divorced or a friend moves away. There's grief in all of those things. I think when we went through the pandemic, we began to recognize a lot of different ways that we grieve. People were grieving all the changes that were happening to their lives, being home from work, their kids being home from school, missing out on events, not to mention all the massive amounts of death and illness that were occurring around the world. And so we began to really open up to the idea that grief is kind of ever present, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's a process that we have to go through. It's a way of honoring something that we cared about, someone that we loved deeply.
Right. Oh, I love positioning it that way, looking at it through a more positive lens. And grief is something that is visceral and it is common to every human experience. I don't think you can ride this journey without experiencing loss,
I
certainly. So
agree.
it's embracing it, and you are providing the tools with which to move through it as positively and as easily as possible.
Yeah, I hope so. I really wanted to kind of present this way of looking at it for people.
Mm.
I've been a therapist for almost 2 decades now, and I sit with people day in and day out who are in all various forms and states and timelines of grief, but there's always a lot of confusion about it. Am I doing
Yeah.
this right? What am I supposed to do at this point? Should I still be feeling this way?
Yeah.
Am I crying too much? Am I not crying enough? All kinds of things that people have so many questions about. So, trying to provide some amount of reassurance and just framework for it to help people move through it.
It's really important. I think it's why we have that phrase, suffer in silence, right?
Mm.
It's just something that we have done
Mhm.
in the past and past generations. We, keep our grief to ourselves and try and manage it alone. But now you're making it a little bit more accessible. So, what do you think takes us by surprise when we are going through the grieving process?
I think there's a few things. I think one of them is the enormity of emotions that we experience. For some of us, when we go through the loss of someone close to us, we may have never experienced that amount of emotion. The sadness, the fear, perhaps anger that comes when you lose someone close to you, it can be overwhelming. You don't know what to expect of yourself at any given moment. You could be walking across a room feeling okay, and the next minute you're on your knees weeping. You go to the grocery store and you don't know what to do with yourself, or you're not sure how to behave in social situations anymore because you're not sure what to expect of your own emotions and how they're going to come. So there's that aspect of it. I think we often don't think about or overlook the secondary losses that come with big loss. You lose a partner, a spouse, a parent. There can be financial hardships. There can be changes to your work and career. There can be changes within your family dynamics. There can just be a lot of secondary losses that occur. And those are tremendously overwhelming for people.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think that grief can be very disorienting on many levels. You're just dropped into a new world and you're trying to figure out where stable ground is and who you are now within the face of this.
So, Claire, let's talk about the idea of being stuck. People often
Hmm.
get stuck in their grief, fearful that if they let go of the grief, that they're letting go of their loved one as well that's passed away. How do we get unstuck and learn to let go without fear?
Yeah, that's a good question. I hear that word stuck all the time in my work. And I think it's pretty common and pretty easy and also understandable that we get stuck in grief. There's a lot of resistance to it, right? This huge thing has happened to your life, all of these emotions, all of these changes, and you sometimes just kind of freeze up. You don't know what to do, where you need help, where to even start with things. A lot of us go through losses where the relationship may have been complicated, or maybe we had a really intense caregiving experience, or our person had a long illness, or there was a traumatic death. Here in America, we're going through these constant mass shootings that are horrific. Deaths
Mhm.
like that lend themselves to a very complicated grief. There may be guilt involved, there may be regret and remorse, there may be anger. There's so many different things that sometimes they feel like, how are you ever going to resolve that? Because the person is gone and the thing has happened. There's no way to change anything about it. And so we end up getting kind of stuck. We just sit with that guilt, or we sit with that anger, or we try to close the door on all of it. I believe there are ways to move through a lot of those things, but it takes some work, it takes some
Mhm.
time, and it often takes some support. There's
Mhm.
tools like writing, there's therapy, there's meditation, there's community support. All of these kinds of things can help us move through some of the more difficult aspects of grief. Because until we resolve some of those things, it's really hard to just feel that pure pain and sadness and missing that is a very real part of grief.
Both Heather and I read your book, and the sections where you talk about the complexity of some grief
Mhm.
really resonated with me as well. You mentioned guilt, but there's also regret and shame often that accompanies the grieving process. Why are they so common, these feelings? And how do you move towards that self acceptance when things are so complicated?
Well, I think that our Western culture is not so great at holding space for grief. And so that is a very easy way to bring on shame for someone. Because if everyone around you is expecting you to get better quickly or move on quickly, and you're just not because it's a huge loss, you begin to feel like there's something wrong with you. So all this
Mm,
shame creeps in. I mean, in America, we have what, 3 to 5 days of bereavement leave. What is the
really?
message that that sends to someone? Say you lose a husband and you get 3 to 5 days off of work. That's essentially telling the person that, you should be over it after 3 to 5 days. You should be ready to get back to work. And when you're not, and you're 6 months in, a year in, and you're still really struggling with all of the changes and all of the emotions, then you really begin to feel like something's wrong with you. And that shame, that self-doubt, that confusion sets in. I think one of the best remedies for it is not only self compassion, but really finding community support, finding others who can recognize and see and validate what you're going through. I run a lot of online support groups and in person retreats. And when you see people come together and be able to share their experiences, maybe it's a couple of widows 2 or 3 years out from their loss, and everyone around them is, kind of done listening or hearing about their grief, and or not recognizing it at all anymore, but they can come together and see each other and not have to explain anything. There's such profound healing that happens in those moments.
I could see how that would be incredibly healing. I mean, it's almost ridiculous that we have these preconceived ideas, these timelines regarding grieving when grieving is as personal as we are.
Yeah, exactly.
I think in your book at one point you were talking about, not everybody grieves right away,
Hmm.
right? Sometimes it comes later. And
It's really
and most
true.
people think it should have been done already.
Hmm. It's very true. My mom died when I was 18, and I didn't even cry for the first year. I think I was in so much shock. I was kind of numb. I was also at an age where I was very self involved. And then after a bit of time, it really came on, and the enormity of the loss really hit me. And then I cried for like 5 years,
Yeah.
Um, and I still miss her to this day.
And the shocking thing for people who are grieving, at least I know from my own personal experience, everybody else has moved on in the world,
Yeah. Yeah.
which can be difficult.
That's the other reason for community support. It's so lonely sometimes. It can be really isolating and really lonely.
Now, you speak often about being curious in your book, even about the afterlife itself. How does identifying our own belief system about death support our transformation through grief?
I think it's a really important part of the grieving process. Everything about our identity can change with a big loss, and everything kind of gets called into question. You may have a really firm belief system going into a loss, and then this person is gone, and you can't help but wonder, where are they, and are they okay? All those identity shifts are so big, and I've seen people really call into question their own faith, or they maybe have come from a place of not having any at all and are now looking for some kind of framework for which to
Right.
understand this experience. And I think that's okay. I do think it's important to be curious about our grief process. Open up to it, get to know it, look at how what environments make you feel safe and comforted and supported, what places are triggering and you don't need to go into anymore. One of the really kind of beautiful aspects of grief is that it kind of levels things out, and you're like, oh, you know what? I do not need to be in that relationship anymore. That friendship is not
Mhm.
serving me. Maybe I'm going to change my job, because it really shows you what matters in life.
Right. Reevaluate.
Yeah. And so be curious, open up to the experience, see what it has to teach you.
And there's no right and wrong.
No, there's no right and wrong at all. The only wrong way to grieve is to not grieve, is to try to suppress it and to push it away. And a lot of people do that out of fear and out of lack of support.
Well, this has been a truly beautiful conversation. What a gift this book is. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. If you would like to purchase Claire Bidwell Smith's book, we will include it in our link in our show notes. You can also follow her on Instagram at Claire Bidwell Smith, on X at Claire Bidwell, or on Facebook as well. Thanks so much, Claire.
Thank you.
I am definitely going to share her book with some people in my life. It's so well laid out and just normalizes the grieving process. And there's so much comfort in that. And it's so necessary, especially when the casseroles stop being delivered and things get awfully quiet.
Yeah, I think this was one of the hardest things to deal with when my father passed away 24 years ago, watching how everyone just got on with their life as if nothing had happened. You know, he was a larger than life personality, so it got very quiet when he died. And the silence became even more noticeable when everyone eventually stopped checking in.
Yeah.
It's tough when you're in the depths of your grief, you know?
It sure is. And it's the simple things that can be really hard, but they are also the things that can kind of help you move through your grief. Low stakes grief activities like taking a shower, making something to eat, sleeping, and maybe just getting out of the house, right?
Well, it would certainly be hard to prioritize your self-care if you were going through grief solo. But maybe it's just as hard when you have dependents as well.
Yeah, it's tricky to make yourself a priority when you still need to care for other people.
So, what are some other low effort activities one can do to take their mind off their grief, even momentarily?
Yeah, well, this might sound, pretty basic, but just look for a distraction. Flip through your favorite magazines or even just watch a movie and maybe watch something you've never seen before. You don't want to get triggered by some memories of sharing, that experience with your loved one.
Yeah, I could see how watching certain movies could be distressing. Now, you mentioned getting out of the house. Physical activity is so important.
It really is so important for our mood. Walking, running, even bouncing on a trampoline. Get some sun on your face and just get out into the world for a little bit. And if you want a really simple way of feeling a sense of accomplishment, make your bed.
That sounds so easy, but it can be so difficult when you're grieving.
It sure can. But if you do make your bed, at least you can say you've accomplished something that day. And there is a bit of a bonus of being able to crawl back into it, right?
Yeah. And aside from maybe making your bed, you can do a lot of things with others.
Yeah, you sure can. Rope a friend into that walk or watching that movie. Choose people, though, that you feel super comfortable with. People you don't need to even talk to if you don't feel like it.
Good advice, Harris. I know I began to heal when I focused my attention on celebrating the life of my father daily.
How did you do that?
Well, I made a point of retelling stories, often funny stories that we could all enjoy and feel good about. After witnessing the pain and suffering he experienced before he died, it was a relief to remember him with joy and laughter, especially since he had such a great sense of humor.
Yeah.
We came up with little rituals to celebrate him. Because he used to enjoy a drink of scotch, we would have a drink and think of him on his birthday, and we would pour a little on his grave during our visits.
Oh.
We also light a candle, one that he bought before his last Christmas. We light it when we are decorating the Christmas tree, and then light it once again at the end of the Christmas season. I've been doing this, I guess since 1999, every year.
Wow, that is a really nice tradition.
Well, celebrating your loved one's life does help, but it takes a while to get to that point. When my dad passed, I didn't feel like celebrating anything right away. I was simply too sad and frankly too exhausted.
Yeah, of course you were. It does take everything out of you. Swiss psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross described a 5-stage grief model in her book On Death and Dying: Denial, Anger, Bargaining, Depression, and Acceptance. But of course, not everybody experiences all 5 stages, and nor does everyone go through these stages in a linear manner.
Okay, just curious, what is the bargaining stage?
Well, somebody might say, God, if you let this person live, I promise I will never do this or that again, right? I actually know somebody who begged his partner that if she survived her stroke, that they would get married, but she passed. It was really, really heartbreaking.
Well, it comes from a feeling of desperation, doesn't it?
Oh, for sure. And grieving is also so personal. We all deal with it in different ways. Some people cocoon and retreat, and some people are like me who flee and escape.
Have you ever heard of the Selah Care Farm?
I have not.
Well, the Selah Care Farm is a 20-acre farm located 15 minutes outside of Sedona, Arizona, where those who are grieving can heal. It's the first care farm in the United States and the first care farm for traumatic grief in the world. It came about after Dr. Joanne Cacciatore rescued an abused pack horse named Chemico in the Grand Canyon. She found that her grieving clients found it a healing experience to spend time with her rescued horse. This evolved into research on the topic of the powerful healing effects of care farms. And together with Dr. Rich Gorman, she founded Selah Care Farm in 2016.
Wow, that sounds like an incredible place. What a great concept.
It really is, both for animals and people. The farm houses more than 50 rescued animals now, and they have 6,500 square feet of housing facilities and multiple barns. According to their website, our grieving families know what it means to suffer, and so do these animals.
Wow. So are there services there that are offered beyond connecting with the rescue animals?
Well, when you visit the farm, you'll experience a different approach to traumatic grief. According to their website, they focus on 3 forms of healing. One is care farming, and this involves gardening and therapeutic horticulture, animal therapy, rescue animal caregiving, green recreation, landscape maintenance, and ecotherapy. Then there are the contemplative practices that are centered around meditation and centered prayer, mindfulness-based support groups, bibliotherapy, grounding, and ritual. And of course, they also address physical well-being through yoga, physical activity, and psychoeducation around sleep hygiene, healthy eating, stress resilience, and traumatic grief counseling. They have lots of support on site, including grief counselors, yoga teachers, and meditation teachers. It's a really neat idea.
Yeah, it sounds incredible. There are a lot more grief retreats, I think, out there now these days, probably following their model. But I think just the change of scenery itself offers a fresh perspective on grief and moving forward.
Exactly. The purpose of visiting the farm is to work through your problems rather than simply escape them, which
Right.
is a neat idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Family grief counselor Jill Cohen says that people who are grieving sometimes decide they need to take a vacation, but they're worried about being judged for it.
Ah, right. There are societal beliefs surrounding how long one should grieve and how.
Yeah, that's true. You know, Walker, those who are grieving also set unrealistic expectations for themselves too.
Like?
Well, I think one tough hurdle for many of us when we have lost someone is to allow ourselves respite from the grief.
So you mean along the lines of, my loved one doesn't have the luxury of joy or happiness anymore, so I shouldn't either.
Exactly. Jill Cohen says that we often wonder, does having fun mean I don't miss my loved one anymore?
So how does she suggest that we handle this sort of thinking?
Well, take the case of the vacation. She says, flip the perspective. Vacations are not just for happy people.
Right, which they aren't.
Right. Cohen suggests that travel can be helpful in many ways when experiencing grief. We get a change of scenery, like I said, which can lift us up, allow us to gain fresh perspectives, and help us get unstuck.
Well, this totally makes sense. We talked about this before, Harris. If we have the ability to get away, a little holiday can allow us to reset, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally too.
Absolutely. Cohen also says that a vacation can prove that the wider world still exists beyond our grieving. It can be kind of comforting to know that when we're ready, it'll be there waiting for us.
Oh, I like this. It's a beautiful reminder.
Also, it can be helpful to get away from our overwhelm by surrounding ourselves with people who aren't connected to our loss experience. In her words, a vacation gives you the time to feel, think, discover, and mourn on your own terms.
So she really thinks that a vacation is a healthy way to move through grief.
Yeah, it sounds like it. A griefcation might not be what we want, but it might just be what we need.
So if we have someone in our lives who is experiencing grief, suggesting a vacation is one way we can support them, I would think.
Most definitely. And of course, there's other things we can do just to let them know that we're there for them. There are the traditional gestures of sympathy, like sending cards or flowers or donating to a cause that's important to the family. But there's the practical things too. Like there are all kinds of apps out there right now that can organize a community of friends and family in providing food and offering other assistance like childcare or transportation. But I think most importantly, we just have to be patient and available. The grief-stricken may or may not wish to share their emotions, and they may or may not want you to either. So as they say, read the room, follow their cues.
And of course, there are doctors, grief counselors, and grief support groups that are available to help.
It's a process, Walker, and it's not an easy one, but it's always better if you know you're not alone.
Right. Claire Bidwell Smith really highlights in her book how transformational grief can be, and in a positive sense, too. It can teach us so much.
Most definitely, and I think that's what I loved most about her message.
Now, Monique Minahan, author of the article 5 Things Grief Taught Me, also shares some important lessons that she learned during her own grief. She firmly believes that sometimes grief does not have to be let go of. It just needs to be let out.
Yeah, I love that. That totally resonates with me.
Now, we can do this in so many ways. Journaling, like Claire's book suggests, being physical, or even just talking, which, let's be real, at times might be screaming. We can decide what feels best for us.
Okay.
Monique Minahan says releasing is not the same as relinquishing. Don't you love that?
I love that.
I love this quote of hers. She says, "My grief is mine forever. When I release her into the world through words or conversation or tears, she is free to leave for a while or return right away. The same or changed, but always welcome in this heart."
Oh, I love that too. She welcomes it, but she can allow it to come and go. That sounds so healthy to me.
Yeah, grief also taught her what it means to be vulnerable.
Yeah, it really does strip you down to your foundation, doesn't it?
Exactly, but listen to her description of how grief exposes us. She says, "The way life tears down every wall we've built, every label we've claimed, every role we've identified with, and reveals a broken, beating heart that is not sure if it wants to live or die."
Oh my gosh, that is absolutely beautiful and so accurate too.
It is. She says that if we can brave that feeling of vulnerability, there are people, our support systems waiting to hear us. It can be remarkably healing. And then we discover we do not need to move through this process alone.
It's so comforting.
Isn't it? But sometimes, even if we have the love and comfort of others available to us, we just can't bring ourselves to accept it. She reflected that being in nature soothed her. She's quite poetic in her description of her grief process. Definitely worth looking her up.
I'd say. I find being in nature massively soothing and meditative. It brings clarity to my thoughts, but it also, I think, calms the nervous system down. Don't you think?
Oh, yes. The natural world factors in quite prominently in the death rituals and grieving in many cultures, both current and those lost to time.
I feel like we have been finding our way back to healthy grieving and perhaps embracing loss as a part of our existence. The pain maybe is a lot in our resistance to grieving. We all want to believe that we will live forever, and I think we just need a new perspective, Walker. Just listen to the beauty of this. Jack Kornfield, one of the masters of mindfulness and a Buddhist practitioner, once remarked upon the Lakota's grief process. He said, "Lakota grief was something to be valued. It brought a person closer to God. For when a person has suffered great loss and was grieving, they were considered the most holy. Their prayers were believed to be especially powerful, and others would ask the grievers to pray on their behalf." Isn't that beautiful in so many ways?
It really is.
The Lakota people would hold a lock of hair from a departed person over burning sweetgrass, purifying it. Then it was wrapped in a piece of sacred buckskin, and this is what they called the soul bundle, which was kept for about 1 year in the home of the soul's keeper, which was usually a relative. The keeper of the soul vowed to live a harmonious life until that soul could be released. Then the soul bundle was carried outside, and as soon as it reached the air, the soul was released with a lot of ceremony.
That is absolutely lovely. It allows time to pass. It encourages community bonding and care for the grieving. And the finality of death is just not there.
Right.
It's just a transition for their loved one.
Exactly. I also came across an artist who promotes the creation of a mourning altar when we're experiencing grief.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
So these are these gorgeous impermanent works that are created out of items from the natural world, and they're kind of similar to mandalas. Day Schildkrit is the internationally renowned earth artist and author of Mourning Altars, who teaches this hands-on practice that is a celebration of life and nature. She conducts workshops that will calm the mind, connect you back to the wisdom of the earth, and also provide the tools and teaching to turn grief into beauty. It's just amazing. She believes that this practice can address what she sees as our grief illiteracy and death phobia.
Well, perhaps we in the West are finally reclaiming our grief. With nature retreats and these exceptional people who are transforming our grief process, we certainly are becoming more accepting of grief as an unavoidable detour on the human journey.
I think it might be fitting to quote from Claire's book, After This, When Life is Over, Where Do We Go? To just wrap this up, Walker. She says, "We can remain gray and immobile in the wake of our losses, or we can open ourselves up to the world, let the sun shine in, fill our surroundings with heaps of flowers, and know that we loved someone truly and deeply." Thank you for joining us at Home and Abroad with your host, Harrison Walker. If you enjoyed this episode, you would be a real gem if you would rate and review our show. It helps us to grow and expand our reach. You can also subscribe to follow us each week as we continue the conversation. Find us on Instagram at @HarrisonWalker or visit us at www.harrisonwalker.com. We have great merch, just saying. And of course, we would love to hear from you.